Chapter 11. The Invitation to Dinner. We were enjoying the lively conversation and evening meal and were not aware of what was brewing in the dark outside the house. No one heard any vehicle drive up, so no vehicle with doors opening or shutting, no whispering, extraneous sounds or voices. The reason for the military-like stealthy approach to our house would soon be evident. About 8 p.m., when it was dark outside, without warning, the door to our house burst open. There was no inquiring knock or courtesy hello. Anyone home? May I come in? To announce the presence of someone wishing to visit. We all had a confused moment of surprise. I happened to be facing the door, and Bill was on the other side of the table facing away from the door. A tall soldier, dressed in the light brown camouflage uniform of the South Vietnamese Army, confidently strolled into the room. It should be noted that this was highly unusual for anyone in that culture to enter a strange house uninvited, as it is in most cultures around the world. However, we tried to adjust quickly to the untimely visit and be as welcoming and hospitable as we could. Notably, this was not the commanding officer that I had wronged that morning, but likely one of his lower-ranking officers. I never did hear whether he was here on orders from his commanding officer or whether he had heard what had happened and had decided to act on his own. But then I hadn't yet put this soldier together with what had happened that morning, and we were all thinking Viet Cong home invasion, despite the South Vietnamese Army uniforms. And since I had not told the other expatriates at the French house about what had happened at the clinic that morning, none of the questions made sense to them, so they were still thinking Viet Cong home invasion, to attack the base across the road. I also never came to hear his name, so to make identification easy, let us call him Doutin, meaning first, since he was the first soldier in the house. Doe strode up to the table, whereupon Bill Harrod, a visiting VNCS administrator from Saigon, stood politely and invited the soldiers to have tea with us. Bill asked one of the other volunteers if they might make the gentleman a cup of tea so that we could sit down and talk a bit and find out if there was a problem. Dow took a chair at the head of the table, and Bill and I on either side of the table, facing one another. Dow sat on my right and to the left of Bill. We could easily see the crossbody holster, which would have enabled the soldier to easily draw and shoot quickly. Neither Bill nor I had ever seen a holster quite like that before. The sight of the gun in plain view, holstered in the middle of his chest, was unnerving to both of us. Since then we had little idea of what his intentions were. During the small talk that followed, I found Dow's command of the English language with little to no accent almost faultless. From his communication alone, it was obvious that he was an educated and very intelligent man. The lack of accent was likely a testament to the fact that he had spent considerable time in the West in English-speaking countries. His first question upon entering was, "Where is the white coat doctor?" This soldier had not seen any of us before this encounter, so he wanted to be sure that he had the right person in his sights. There was some confusion then, since I had just changed clothes from my day at the hospital, and it took some convincing and repeated questioning to have him believe that I was Dr. Stuckey. Once he understood that I was the doctor in question, the white coat wearing one, not the blue one, he turned his attention to me, and after some brief talk, he extended a very cordial invitation to his home for dinner. Well, now, that was a bit of a surprise. This situation was just getting weirder by the minute. A soldier quietly sneaks up on our house, bursts in uninvited, and now he's inviting me to dinner? Under almost any other circumstances, I would have been honored and thrilled to be invited to a special dinner in my honor, but here something felt off and insincere. He explained that his wife had prepared a very special Vietnamese dinner in appreciation for my having seen his commander's 2 boys in the clinic that morning. In reality, I could not recall ever having seen or recently examining 2 Vietnamese boys of the age he had described, but by that time I had picked up the clues as to whom and what situation he was referring to. In reality, the commander had stormed out of the clinic and had taken his 2 sons with him, so I never did in fact lay eyes on them. However, I thought it was wise to not make mention of this fact for the moment. I was still trying to process this weird and uncomfortable situation in my mind and what I might be able to do to keep the fallout of the visit to a minimum. Bill was thinking the same thing. It was very perplexing to me that a Vietnamese family would prepare a special meal for me to be served late at night without giving me an earlier invitation to attend. I had been in Vietnam long enough by that time to understand how unusual and even culturally inappropriate that was. As such, having reasonable doubts about the sincerity of such an invitation, I responded with my regrets that I could not leave the hospital unattended at that time of night without having made prior arrangements for emergency coverage by another physician. Dal made a face clearly showing disappointment with my response. He described how much time and effort his wife had made in preparing such a fine meal. As we continued our conversation, Bill and I tried to diffuse the underlying tenor of the conversation and again complimented him on his articulate command of the English language. That seemed to help temporarily, as he then digressed enough from his main objective of the evening to explain that he had been sent to the United States to learn how to train Vietnamese military pilots to fly the new model of the U.S. helicopter. That was likely the UH-1 Iroquois or the Huey, named for the phonetic sound of its designation. He described spending a significant amount of time at the U.S. Army base for training the South Vietnamese pilots who were brought over to the U.S. for that training. This certainly explained his excellent command of the English language. So, just to be clear, there was no language barrier in what he was saying now or would say to me later. There was also little reason for misunderstanding what he was trying to say to Bill and me. Although he named the base, I do not recall the specific location, though I faintly remember him mentioning one of the Carolinas. I later learned that Fort Bragg's, now Fort Liberty, in North Carolina, is one of the largest military bases in the world and home to 10, 15, 18 airborne corps, if I have my numbers correct there. So, could it possibly have been at Fort Bragg's that he was trained? Those more informed about the U.S. military and their training bases might know. I don't. In any case, he continued to recount his experience on the U.S. Army base and described the relationships as one of marked disrespect towards him and the other Vietnamese soldiers. He recalled many times the U.S. Army soldiers referred to him as one of those gooks, or a monkey. Bill and I were both quite familiar with such terms being used about the Vietnamese rice farmers in black shirts and pants, whom U.S. military soldiers simply often assumed to be Viet Cong. Many were just rural rice farmers in their fields trying to simply raise a crop for a living. But to be fair, it was known that subversive elements would sometimes try to infiltrate the area by dressing in similar apparel to the locals. We later learned that some of us met and even unknowingly talked to Viet Cong soldiers at times. They, of course, knew from their family ties that we were not in Vietnam with the U.S. we were not in Vietnam with the U.S. military meant them no harm, and in turn allowed us to carry out our respective missions for the Vietnamese people. But to our dismay and horror, we learned from reliable sources that our amusement U.S. soldiers would even use their assault rifles to take pot shots from afar at these peasant men and women working in their fields, dressed in their traditional garb while they attend to their rice paddies. It didn't seem to matter whether they were confirmed Viet Cong infiltrators or simply rice farmers tending to their fields. In a way, it was guilty until proven innocent. That traditional garb included the typical Vietnamese conical hat. These conical hats were called nong le by the Vietnamese, and it seemed that their hats made a good target for those few soldiers who seemed to place little value on human life. In any case, Dow already had a chip on his shoulder from prior experience at the American military base, and stories like this, true or untrue, certainly didn't help our situation, even though, unbeknownst to him, we sympathized with his feelings about the unholy military alliance. Suddenly, Dow turned to face me and blurted out, "Oh, so you think that all Americans are intelligent and all Vietnamese are stupid?" I was shocked and a bit taken aback by the sudden change in the conversation and protested. "No, I love to speak with Vietnamese people who speak English fluently, given that my knowledge of the Vietnamese language is so limited." The look on Dow's face following this exchange clearly reflected his understanding of my response. The affirmation in my response seemed to calm him some for the moment. So again, Dow returned to his invitation for me to come to a banquet-like meal that his wife had prepared in appreciation for me examining the sons of the commander. I again responded that I could not leave the hospital and my responsibilities that night. There were a few more positive exchanges of conversation, which included a third try at convincing me to come to his home for that special meal. I, on the other hand, could only repeat that I would be unable to leave the hospital and come to his home for dinner that evening. In retrospect, it became clear to me that these pseudo-invitations were simply a way of trying to convince me to amicably walk out of the house, separate myself from the other volunteers, and do it without the use of force or violence. But after my last refusal to accept his invitation, just as abruptly as he had entered the house, he pushed back from the table, rose to his feet, quickly drew his pistol, and ordered everyone in the room to stay right where they were. This galvanized everyone in the room, and all eyes were immediately on Dow and where he was pointing the gun. With my concentration fully on Dow, I am unclear to this day who among the volunteers was left in the room other than Bill and I. My mind was so focused on Dow and his actions that I became unaware of the surrounding people in the room except for Bill. It was like I had tunnel vision, but I believe that by that time Ron Ackerman and Mars Gasatya had already left the table and gone to their respective rooms as the conversation took on a more confrontational tone. So it was just Bill and I who stayed riveted to our chairs, not wishing to exasperate the situation any further. Dow then summoned some lower-ranking soldiers from outside the house by yelling, "Oi!" several times. It became obvious to us in hindsight that these soldiers had been armed and waiting all the time just outside the house, awaiting his command to enter and take up supportive positions for Dow. It further clarified for me the stealthy approach to our house, the reason for the unannounced visit, the intent of the conversation. In my mind, there was no good reason to bring a backup group of armed soldiers to my house to invite me to a special dinner. The first to enter the house appeared to be a somewhat bold and battle-hardened soldier, about 40-ish in age. I'll call him Dam Kung, meaning bold and hardened, in Vietnamese. His first question was also, "Where is the white coat doctor?" I identified myself again, but Dam Kung intentionally seemed suspicious and didn't seem to believe me when he observed my casual dress. I wasn't wearing anything near a white coat at the time. In comparison, Bill looked more like a doctor in his blue, more formal Nehru light jacket. However, I persisted and identified myself several times as the doctor for whom he was looking for. Once the question of my identity was cleared up, Dom circled the table, grabbed me by my shirt collar, yanked me up out of my chair, and pretty much manhandled me out towards the kitchen, likely to separate me from the others in the room. By that time, 2 more soldiers' reinforcements had arrived, carrying U.S.-issued M16 assault rifles. One of the soldiers was waving around an M16 rifle menacingly, and I'm fairly sure that any attempt at resistance or quick movements by any of the expatriates would have resulted in a response that would not have ended well for us unarmed expatriates. Bill recalled somewhat humorously later on that he had a camera with an electronic flash on the table within reach. A momentary thought for him was, what if I grabbed the camera off the table and set off the flash in the soldier's face? It would blind the soldier momentarily and allow us to maybe incapacitate him. But then a wiser part of him thought, no, if I go flash, the gun will go bang and the outcome won't be good. I call the third soldier who entered the house Ba, roughly meaning number 3. There was a fourth soldier who I'll call Ut, meaning youngest, who was wearing camouflage just like the rest of the soldiers, but Ut was much younger and couldn't have been out of his teens. However young though he was, Ut was still carrying an M16 assault rifle, and as nervous and agitated as he appeared, I figured he was just as dangerous as the others. During this time, Marcy and Akai had been in their bedroom and had heard the commotion in the main room. Unfortunately, the front door to the house opened with the kitchen on the right and Akai and Marcy's room on the left. So when Dom Kung pushed me into the kitchen, it was directly across from Akai and Marcy's room. The commotion created could be easily heard in their room. Unfortunately, neither had been privy to the preceding conversation and its downward spiral. They walked into the situation unaware of what was transpiring. If they had understood what was happening, I'm sure that they would have reacted a bit differently or just stayed in their rooms. First, Akai decided to check out the commotion and came out of the bedroom. He was immediately confronted by Dao and told to go sit at the table and put his hands on the table like Bill. Then, not long after, Marcy opened the door and came into the room. I remember this slightly different from Marcy, but the end result was the same. According to Marcy's account in her writings, she spoke to the youngest soldier in Vietnamese, who pointed his rifle at her. She said, "Bao Mong Gaya Dai, what do you want here?" He replied, "I don't know." And she replied in disbelief, "You don't know?" In my recollection, but with my limited Vietnamese, I heard it slightly differently. Being unaware of what had just transpired in the main room, Marcy strolled in and quickly took in the situation in front of her. Seeing the soldiers with guns drawn in the kitchen and main room, I heard her say something to the effect of, "What gives you the right to come into my house with guns?" Those may not have been her exact words in Vietnamese, but the reaction from the young soldier was very telling. He had likely been trained to take orders from foreign nationals, maybe U.S. military advisors, who were usually professional soldiers and those in charge and higher ranking. So his immediate reaction was instinctive, and he began to obediently lower his M16. But then came a definite pause where he had the time to think through the situation. I suspect that he thought, wait a minute, we have the guns and we're the ones in charge now. He immediately brought his weapon back up and pointed it directly at Marcy's chest. She screamed and then completely put up her hands and to her credit, did not say another word. I will digress for a moment and state that the trauma of that simple short event caused Marcy to soon leave and never set foot in the French house again. I can't say I blame her, as I think most people might react in a similar way, having just narrowly escaped death in that place. She soon moved out of the French house and into the center of Pleiku, where she felt safer. After that short altercation with Marcy seemed to be settled, the soldiers again placed their attention back on me. At this point, the realization of where this could be heading began to slowly creep into the far recesses of my brain. So I asked Dow if I might say goodbye to my wife, who had been in and out of our bedroom, but had finally taken baby Jonathan and stayed in the bedroom when the conversation had become a bit more uncomfortable. She was thus not aware of the guns that had been drawn and the precarious situation we were all in. It soon became clear that there would be no tearful goodbyes, as his response was to pistol whip me across the head and tell me to get outside and into the Jeep. So Dow, myself, Dom, Ba, and Ut marched outside, and I was ordered to get into the front passenger seat while Dow got into the driver's seat. Dom and Ba sat in the second row of seats, and back in the rear of the Jeep was the young, anxious teenage soldier with his M16 mercifully pointed at the canvas roof. I learned later that after they took me at gunpoint, the rest of the expatriates in the house had some quick decisions to make. Those in the main room had been yelled at by Dow as we left not to leave the house because soldiers were guarding outside. So what were they to do? The first thing they did was to turn out the lights to make it more difficult for anyone outside to see into the house. Then they informed Jeannie that Alan had been taken at gunpoint. Marcy was the one chosen to give the bad news to Jeannie, and I am sure it wasn't easy. Then, according to Bill, they waited about 15 minutes and decided it was time to try to notify a higher authority. They had talked amongst themselves about what had just happened. After all, they had not been present at the hospital that morning and didn't understand the gravity of the situation. At this point, the only thing Bill and Ron could think was that this was a replay of what had happened to Dan Gerber 9 years earlier in 1962. In their minds, the only way they could explain the ARVN uniforms was that this was an abduction by Viet Cong wearing South Vietnamese Army uniforms. And if that was so, then Alan's life was in danger. If South Vietnamese or U.S. forces were tracking these soldiers and might decide to fire upon the Jeep, not knowing that Alan was in it. So Bill and Ron decided to alert Dave Workman, the VNCS unit leader, who lived a short distance from the French house, to get his opinion on what to do next. They looked out the windows of the French house, and after seeing no movement for about 15 minutes, decided to slowly walk out of the house in a non-threatening manner with hands raised. No one approached them or called out to them to halt, so Bill and Ron got in the unit Jeep, drove to Dave Workman's house, and told him what had just happened at the French house. Among the three of them, they decided that local U.S. authorities needed to be notified immediately of the abduction. Bill recalls that he and Ron raced off somewhat recklessly in the dark in a Jeep at high speeds to talk to the authorities and notify them of the abduction. Once that mission was accomplished, there was little they could do but wait.